Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today, I want to look at Severus Snape not through a lens of sympathy, but with a colder, more clear-eyed perspective, and maybe remind you why, behind the mask of a hero, there was far from a saintly man. Number 1, bias and favoritism towards Slytherin. Let's begin with the mildest, but still telling, issue. Snape consistently abused his authority by blatantly favoring students from his own house. Points: Slytherin goes up, everyone else goes down. A Slytherin breaking rules, usually swept under the rug. A Gryffindor's tiniest mistake, punished on the spot. It was especially painful to watch Neville Longbottom suffer. The way Snape treated him crossed every line. Neville's boggart even took Snape's form, and that says it all. Number 2, insulting Hermione's appearance. The film skipped this, but in The Goblet of Fire there's a moment that's hard to forget. After a duel between Harry and Malfoy, Hermione is hit with a curse that makes her front teeth grow rapidly and grotesquely. And what does Snape do when he sees her? He coldly remarks, "I see no difference." For a girl already insecure about her teeth, such a comment from an adult teacher was downright cruel, and when Harry and Ron stood up for her, Snape mercilessly took 50 points from them. Number 3, poisoned jabs at Sirius Black. Sirius and Snape had a tangled history going back to their school days, but while Sirius mellowed out over time, Severus kept aiming for the jugular. He knew how much Sirius struggled with his forced confinement at Grimmauld Place, and that's exactly where he struck. Those constant taunts were one of the reasons Sirius rushed to the Ministry of Magic. He wanted to take action to prove he still mattered, and in that fatal moment he never came back. No, Snape didn't kill him, but he pushed the situation to its breaking point. Number 4, total failure teaching occlumency to Harry. Harry's 5th year was a nightmare, and the icing on that bitter cake, occlumency lessons with Snape. The goal was to teach Harry how to block Voldemort from invading his mind. The reality? Constant clashes, humiliation, and scorn. Harry couldn't focus, and Snape, instead of being a mentor, turned into an accuser. And when Harry accidentally glimpsed one of Snape's most painful memories, Snape simply ended the lessons and left him defenseless. Number 5, dark experiments, the Sectum Sempra spell. Snape was a genius in potions, but he also had a deep draw toward dark magic. In his school years, he created the Sectum Sempra curse, a spell that literally slashes flesh apart. Why would a teenager invent something like that? We never got an answer from Rowling. But the fact alone speaks volumes. This wasn't childish mischief, it was a dangerous, dark impulse. Number 6, personal hatred toward Harry. Snape hated James Potter for the bullying for Lily, and Harry, to him, was a living reminder of the past where he lost everything. He never hid his resentment. From the very first class, Harry was subjected to humiliation. Snape didn't even try to be objective. He actively looked for reasons to embarrass the boy. That's not how a mature mentor behaves. It's obsession and childish spite. Number 7, he was a Death Eater. This isn't rumor or speculation, it's a fact. Severus Snape was a Death Eater. Yes, he later switched sides. Yes, he risked his life for the Order. But you can't just erase the fact that he once willingly followed Voldemort. That means he accepted his ideology, his methods, his goals. And if not for Lily, he might have stayed on that side forever. Number 8, publicly humiliated Neville. Neville Longbottom's potion hissed, then bubbled, then turned a sickly green. He froze. His eyes darted to the black robes behind him. He already knew what was coming. Snape stepped forward like a shadow, silent, controlled. Then his voice sliced through the air. "Longbottom, tell me, is there anything you can do right?" Laughter rippled across the room. Neville shrank, but Snape wasn't finished, not even close. He grabbed the cauldron, lifted it with one hand, walked out into the corridor. Students stared, some paused. Snape placed the steaming mess right in the center of the hallway like it was art. Then he raised his voice. "This," he announced, "was brewed by the most talentless student ever to set foot in Hogwarts." A few students gasped, others laughed. Neville's name echoed down the stone walls. From that day on, whispers followed him, in the great hall, in the library, even on the stairs. "Did you see it?" Snape called him hopeless. Neville didn't respond. He walked with his head low, shoulders tight, always silent. And this wasn't new. Snape had always targeted him, always mocked. But this time he made sure the whole school saw it. Not a mistake, a performance. Number 9. Informed Voldemort about the prophecy. Snape was the reason Voldemort found Harry. It started in a dark, smoky room above the Hog's Head Tavern. Snape stood in the shadows, listening. Trelawney's voice shook. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord," she whispered. He didn't hear it all. Just enough. A child would be born at the end of July, a child who could destroy Voldemort. Snape ran straight to the Dark Lord. No questions, no second thoughts. He handed the prophecy over like a prize. Voldemort listened, chose his target, not Neville, Harry Potter, Lily's son, a decision that would shatter lives. Snape thought he was being clever, loyal, useful, until he found out who the prophecy meant. Then panic hit him like a curse. It was Lily, her son, her family, and he had led Voldemort right to them. Suddenly he cared. Suddenly he was sorry. He ran to Dumbledore, begged, "Hide them! Save her!" But not Harry, not James, just Lily. The rest could burn. That's not love, that's possession. Dumbledore saw through him. "You disgust me," he said coldly. And he was right. Snape wasn't fighting for good. He was trying to fix the horror he had set in motion. Number 10. Wanted Dementors to take Sirius. Snape didn't want Sirius arrested. He wanted him destroyed. Soul gone, body cold, no trial, no mercy. When news broke that Sirius had escaped Azkaban, Snape's eyes gleamed. He wasn't afraid. He was thrilled. At last, he must have thought, he'll pay. Not for crimes, for history, for schoolyard grudges, for every smirk, every prank, every insult from long ago. Then came the night in the shrieking shack. The truth unraveled. Pettigrew was alive. Sirius was innocent. Harry, Ron, Hermione and Lupin all knew it. They begged Snape to listen. He didn't. He didn't want to. "Out of the way, Potter!" he barked, wand raised, hands trembling with rage. I knew he was dangerous. Snape wasn't just deaf to the truth. He fought it. He tried to stun Sirius, tried to silence Harry. Even when faced with evidence, even when Lupin backed the story, Snape clung to his hate. Truth didn't matter. Revenge did. When Sirius escaped on Buckbeak, Snape exploded. He stormed through the halls like a madman, yelled at Dumbledore, threatened the trio. "They helped him," he roared. "They should be punished." He didn't care about facts. He wanted someone to suffer. He even tried to get Harry expelled. Harry, the boy he swore to protect. "No discipline," Snape snarled. "No consequences." But everyone saw through it. This wasn't about rules. It was personal, poisoned. Snape knew what Dementors did. Everyone did. They sucked out your soul, left you hollow. He didn't hesitate. He wanted that fate for Sirius. Wanted to watch it happen. Slowly, painfully. Final. Dumbledore tried to reason with him, but Snape's voice cracked with fury. "You always take their side?" he snapped. He meant James. He meant Sirius. He meant the past. Number 11, bullied students to boost his ego. Snape didn't teach to inspire. He taught to dominate. His classroom wasn't a place of learning. It was a battlefield, and he always made sure the students knew who was in charge. He didn't just criticize mistakes. He humiliated people for them. In the Philosopher's Stone, Neville Longbottom melted a cauldron. The potion spilled everywhere. Instead of guiding him, Snape sneered, "Why don't you try again, Longbottom, or are you afraid you'll kill us all this time?" The class laughed. Neville wanted to disappear. Snape fed on fear. He saw how students flinched when he entered the room, and he liked it. He didn't build respect, he crushed self-esteem. Hermione, the brightest student in her year, once gave an answer before being called on. Snape didn't praise her passion. He snapped, "That is the second time you have spoken out of turn, Miss Granger. Are you incapable of restraining yourself?" Her face fell. He mocked students not just for failure, but for existing. He bullied Ron for his family's poverty, called him out for broken wands and hand-me-down robes. "I see you've brought the usual Weasley standard," Snape said with a smirk during potions. Ron clenched his jaw but said nothing. What could he say? Even Harry, whom Snape claimed to protect, was a constant target. In front of the class, he tore into him. "Fame clearly isn't everything," he said. When Harry didn't know the ingredients of a potion, he could have helped him learn. Instead, he made him feel stupid, again and again. It wasn't strictness, it was psychological warfare. He used his authority to belittle, to remind every child that they were nothing next to him. He didn't earn their trust, he demanded silence. And the students obeyed, not from respect, but from fear. Number 12, refused to save James and Harry. Snape claimed to love Lily Potter, truly, deeply, but when her life was in danger, that love turned dark, twisted. He didn't ask for her family to be saved, only her. It was a moment of truth, one conversation, one brutal line. Snape went to Dumbledore, desperate. Voldemort had chosen Harry, the Potters were being hunted. Snape begged for Lily's life. "Hide them all, then," Dumbledore said. "The boy, the husband, you would spare them too?" Snape didn't hesitate. His answer cut like a knife. "No, just her, just Lily. Not James, not the baby, just Lily. What kind of love is that?" Not love at all. Obsession. Possession. He didn't care what Lily would want. He didn't care what saving only her would do to her. To leave her alone while her husband and child died? That wasn't love. That was cruelty, dressed as longing. Dumbledore saw it. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He stared at Snape with quiet horror. "You disgust me," he later said. And he was right. Snape didn't love Lily in the way a good man loves. He wanted her alive, yes, but not for her. For himself. As if her life was his to claim. Imagine Lily surviving, learning James and Harry had died. What would be left of her? A shell? A woman broken forever? Snape didn't see that, or didn't care. His pain mattered more, his guilt, his wish to undo a mistake by sacrificing everyone else. That's not redemption, that's selfishness. Even after her death, he didn't change. He never showed love to Harry, her son. He tormented him, hated him. Not because of Harry, but because of James. Snape never moved on, never grew up, and never truly honored Lily's memory, not the way she deserved. Number 13, humiliated Lupin and exposed his secret. Snape smiled when Lupin returned to Hogwarts. Not out of joy, out of spite. Old wounds burned fresh. This was his chance. Not to forgive, but to strike back. They had history, ugly history. Back when James Potter humiliated Snape in front of half the school, Lupin just stood there, silent, watching. Snape never forgot that silence, and he never forgave it. So when Lupin walked into Hogwarts as the new defense teacher, Snape didn't see a colleague. He saw a target. From the start, he stirred suspicion. Subtle, slow, like poison. In potions class, he announced, "I've been making a complex potion for Professor Lupin." His tone made it sound like something dark. Students exchanged looks. Lupin's secret was already leaking. Then came the essay. "Today's topic is werewolves," Snape said, eyes gleaming. He chose the one subject that pointed directly at Lupin. He knew students would connect the dots. Hermione did, and others began to wonder. Who was Lupin really? It got worse. After a full moon, Lupin missed class. Snape replaced him, cold, smug. Turn to page 394, werewolves again. Every word he said was a trap. He didn't teach, he baited. The class felt it. Harry felt it. Snape wasn't hiding his game anymore. And then came the shrieking shack, a night of chaos, truths spilled, secrets revealed. But when Snape burst into the hospital wing, he didn't care about the truth. He wanted Sirius Black. He wanted someone to blame. He raged at Lupin, at Harry. "He's just like his father," he spat. His hatred drowned reason. Then came the final blow. Snape let it slip, or so he claimed. The truth about Lupin, that he was a werewolf. The news spread fast. Parents panicked. The board got nervous. Lupin had no choice. "I can't stay," he told Harry quietly. But they both knew. Snape had made sure of it. Number 14. Presumed guilt without proof. Snape didn't need proof. He didn't wait for facts. He saw guilt in every student's face, and especially Harry's. From the moment Harry stepped into his classroom, Snape made it clear, "I'm watching you." Not like a teacher, like a predator. Every mistake was a crime, every glance a reason to punish. Remember the flying car, the chamber of secrets. Ron and Harry crash into the Whomping Willow. Snape drags them to his office, cloak billowing like a dark cloud. No questions, no time to speak, just rage. "I suppose you thought it clever to enter the school like that," he hisses. He doesn't just want attention, he wants them expelled. "I shall be speaking with Professor Dumbledore." His voice practically trembles with delight. And it wasn't just them. Hermione, Neville. Even the quiet ones. No one was safe. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione shows up to class without being seen entering. She used a time turner approved by Dumbledore himself. Snape doesn't care. He glares. "Don't try to be cleverer than you are," he snaps. To him, knowledge wasn't power, it was threat. Neville Longbottom? Snape crushed that boy's spirit. In the Philosopher's Stone, Neville messes up a potion. Again, Snape doesn't help, doesn't teach, he mocks. "Why don't you try again, Longbottom, or are you afraid of causing another explosion?" The whole class laughs. Neville sinks deeper into his seat. A good teacher lifts. Snape broke. Then there's the Quidditch match. Harry's broom goes haywire. Hermione thinks Snape's jinxing it. Turns out he was trying to stop the jinx, but no one believed it. Why? Because Snape had built a reputation of cruelty so strong, even his good deeds looked suspicious. That's what years of unjust hatred do. Number 15. Ignore danger to Katie Bell. It happened on a chilling day in October when the winds howled around the towering spires of Hogwarts and golden leaves skittered like whispers across the courtyard stones. Katie Bell, a Gryffindor chaser, known for her cheerful spirit and tireless energy on the Quidditch pitch, had been walking through Hogsmeade with her friend Leanne. A trip that should have been light-hearted, a simple school outing to the village, ended in horror. It began with a seemingly innocent package, a beautifully wrapped box that contained a necklace. An opal necklace, cursed and dangerous, its sinister past whispered about even in Borgin and Berks. Leanne would later describe the moment with a voice trembling from the memory. Katie had touched the package, just grazed it, and then screamed, a scream that tore through the wind like shattered glass. Her body levitated unnaturally into the air, contorting in agony, her arms flailing, eyes wide with terror as invisible magic ripped through her. Then she collapsed, lifeless for a moment, before moaning in agony on the frozen ground. She would survive, barely, but the message was clear. The curse was meant to kill. The question that haunts many readers is not just who was responsible, though the blame clearly pointed to Draco Malfoy, but who allowed it to happen. Severus Snape, the enigmatic potions master, the double agent with layered loyalties, knew far more than he let on. From early in the 6th year, Snape had made an unbreakable vow to Narcissa Malfoy to protect Draco and, if necessary, complete the mission the Dark Lord had assigned to her son. But protecting Draco came at a cost, and that cost was paid by innocents like Katie. Snape had a unique insight into Draco's activities. He knew the boy was not simply a troubled student acting out. Draco was slipping into the shadows of dark magic, burdened by a task far beyond his years. Snape had seen it in Draco's drawn face, the way he isolated himself, his trembling hands, and the cruel edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. "You are trying to do something dangerous," Snape had said to him one evening, "and I will not let you destroy yourself." These were not just words of concern, they were warnings wrapped in velvet threats. Despite this knowledge, when Katie Bell was struck down by the cursed necklace, meant for someone else most likely, Dumbledore, Snape's response was cold, clinical, and devoid of any visible emotion. He confirmed the nature of the curse, treated her as best he could, and reported to Dumbledore. But he did not reveal Draco's involvement, nor did he warn the rest of the staff about the deadly threat walking their halls. His silence was deafening. One could argue, of course, that Snape was under orders. Dumbledore had tasked him with watching Draco, not confronting him. The headmaster, already dying from the slow-working curse of the Gaunt Ring, believed in giving Draco a chance to choose differently. But did that noble intention justify endangering the lives of other students? Katie was not a pawn in this game. She was a human being, a child, someone's daughter, and a friend to many. And what about Snape's moral compass? In Half-Blood Prince, we see him positioned as a protector of Hogwarts, a man burdened with secret truths. Yet in that moment, when a student lay near death because of dark magic, he displayed an alarming detachment. His demeanor was not one of outrage or urgency. He offered no solace to Leanne, who was crying beside Katie's frozen form. He asked no questions about who gave her the package in the first place. He simply observed, deduced, and returned to his work. Snape's failure to act decisively after the incident is one of the darker stains on his already complicated legacy. It suggests that the safety of the students was not his first priority, at least not in that moment. His first loyalty was to the secret game being played behind the scenes, to Dumbledore's dying plan, to Draco's soul, and perhaps even to the fractured mirror of his own guilt. It's worth noting that the necklace was no idle threat. It had previously killed 19 Muggles, as described by Mr. Borgin in Chamber of Secrets. For Draco to use it as a tool of murder was shocking, but for Snape to recognize it and not expose the chain of responsibility is, in its own way, worse. He knew that Draco was trying to kill. That much was obvious. Yet Snape's response was to shield him from the consequences rather than to stop the attempts altogether. When Dumbledore confronts Snape later, he says, "You must be the one to kill me, Severus. Draco's soul is not yet so damaged." It's a line that sheds light on the strategy behind the silence. But again, it prioritizes Draco's salvation over the safety of others. Katie Bell nearly died. And who would have been next? Ron, who was later poisoned by another of Draco's misguided assassination attempts. These were not harmless pranks, they were deadly gambits, and Snape let them unfold. Some fans argue that Snape was playing a long game, that he needed to maintain Draco's trust to keep Voldemort fooled. But this perspective risks dehumanizing the victims of that plan. Katie wasn't a symbol of collateral damage. She was a teenager who spent weeks in St. Mungo's hospital, her body fighting the lingering effects of the curse. She had dreams, fears, friends, and all of it was almost taken from her. One can't help but imagine what would have happened if someone like McGonagall had been the one to learn of Draco's plan. Would she have stood by as students were maimed and nearly murdered? Or would she have taken immediate action, storming into the dungeons and demanding accountability? The comparison is stark and damning for Snape. Number 16. Emotionally manipulated Harry. The night was quiet when Harry Potter leaned over the dying body of Severus Snape. The man who had haunted his school years, tormented him with sarcasm, withheld kindness like a weapon. This man, with blood pooling beneath him, pulled Harry close and whispered, take it, look at me." And then, with Lily's green eyes reflecting in his, Severus Snape died. But his death was not the end. It was, in truth, the beginning of a final manipulation, a cruel twist written in the pages of a story that Harry thought he understood. Snape's last gift wasn't peace or redemption. It was a cluster of memories, carefully chosen, laced with tragedy and devotion, handed over like a final puzzle piece. And when Harry poured them into the pensieve, what he saw broke him. Among the silvery threads swirled Snape's past, his obsession with Lily Evans, the girl he had loved and lost, and the promise he made to Dumbledore. Always. That word, simple and sharp, pierced through the narrative like a blade. Readers around the world took it as a sign of Snape's undying love. But for Harry, it was something more complex, something cruel. Because Snape never told him this while he was alive, never once offered him the truth, never explained why he treated Harry with such cold disdain. He never said, "I see your mother in your eyes and it burns me." Instead, he sneered, mocked, and humiliated. "Fame isn't everything," he had said on Harry's first day, setting the tone for years of bitterness. Snape didn't guide Harry, he controlled him. He didn't mentor him, he tested him. And at the end, when it mattered most, Snape handed him not comfort, but the unbearable truth. To defeat Voldemort, Harry must die. The boy who lived had to willingly offer himself to death, walk into the forest and let his heart stop beating. And Snape, with perfect timing, dropped this weight onto his shoulders after his own exit, leaving Harry to carry it alone. Why wait? Why hide the truth until the last moment? Snape had years to speak. He had countless opportunities to explain, to confess, to apologize, but he chose silence. He chose secrecy. Even Dumbledore, the master of chessboard manipulations, seemed disturbed by Snape's emotional detachment. "You disgust me," he once told Snape, when the man showed more concern for Lily's son dying than the fate of the child himself. Snape's memories painted him as a tragic hero, but Harry was left to process all this while standing at the edge of death. He learned of Snape's love for his mother not through gentle words, but through ghostly echoes of past conversations. He heard Snape beg Dumbledore to protect Lily. Hide them all then, keep them, safe. But once she died, Snape's interest in the child seemed conditional, transactional, as though Harry's life only mattered because of her. It's easy to be swept up in the romance of it all. A man in black robes, misunderstood, secretly fighting for good while the world sees a villain. But the truth is messier. Snape was a man consumed by pain, and he used that pain like a scalpel, cutting, manipulating, shaping events in ways that served his internal wounds. He did not raise Harry into a hero. He cornered him into sacrifice. Even when he protected Harry, he did so from the shadows, never acknowledging it. The time he blocked Quirrell's jinx during the Quidditch match or tried to stop Lupin from attacking in his werewolf form, these acts remained hidden. He never once said, "I was there for you." Instead, he let Harry grow up thinking Snape wanted him gone. And that was no accident. Snape wanted Harry to hate him. It fit the narrative he wrote for himself. The martyr, the lone protector, suffering in silence, but by refusing to share the truth, he denied Harry the dignity of choice. Snape waited until the war was nearly over, until there was no time left to argue, to question, to resist. He handed Harry a final role and said, "Play this part," then disappeared from the stage. There's something cruel in that. Imagine a boy, barely 17, already battered by war, already having buried friends and mentors, discovering that his life has been manipulated not only by Dumbledore, but by a man who claimed to love his mother. Snape's love was never about Harry, it was about Lily, and in some ways Harry was merely her shadow. "He has her eyes," was the line repeated like a curse, a reminder, a wound. Snape saw her ghost in Harry, and instead of embracing that as a gift, he turned it into resentment. He lashed out at Harry for the crime of existing, for being the son of James, the boy Snape hated more than Voldemort. And still he expected Harry to understand him after death. But understanding doesn't come easy when your abuser leaves you a trail of sorrow disguised as truth. Harry cried in the pensive. He saw a man tormented by guilt, twisted by longing, driven by a love that had turned possessive. But love, real love, doesn't demand sacrifice without consent. It doesn't hide behind silence and theatrics. Snape might have told Harry that he had to die. He might have prepared him, helped him see the necessity, even guided him through it with kindness. But that would have required vulnerability, something Snape feared more than death. So instead, he let Harry stumble upon it in a flood of second-hand memories, delivered with no warning, no support, no time to breathe. Dumbledore himself admitted the manipulation. When Harry asks, "You knew?" Dumbledore replies, "Of course, but you are the true master of death, because you are willing to die." The plan was always for Harry to die, but the burden was Snape's to share. Instead, he dumped it on a teenager already breaking under the weight of prophecy. Number 17. Never admitted his own faults. Of all the shadows cast by Severus Snape throughout the Harry Potter series, one stands darker than the rest. His refusal to ever truly acknowledge his own flaws and mistakes. He bore his guilt in silence, yes, but never did he own it aloud. Never did he utter the simple words, "I was wrong," to those who most deserved to hear it. In that silence lies not just tragedy, but pride and a dangerous unwillingness to take moral responsibility for the pain he helped to inflict. It begins perhaps with Lily Evans. Severus's childhood friendship with her was tender, even beautiful, born of two misfits clinging to one another amidst the cruelty of others. But that bond was severed the moment Severus, in a moment of humiliation, called her a mudblood. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, we witness this moment through the pensive as Lily flinches and walks away. "I don't need help from filthy little mudbloods like her," he shouts. Later, he begs her forgiveness, but crucially, he doesn't take full responsibility. He blames James Potter, the Muggle-born slur slipping from his mouth as though it was someone else's voice. Lily responds, "You've chosen your way, I've chosen mine." It's not the mistake itself that ends their friendship. It's the fact that Snape's apology is tainted by excuse and justification. And this pattern persists. Even in the face of devastating consequences, such as the death of Lily herself, Snape doesn't say, "This was my fault." When he learns that Voldemort intends to kill the Potters, Snape rushes to Dumbledore, pleading for Lily's life. Not James's, not Harry's, just Lily. And even then, he doesn't accept his role in delivering the prophecy that marked them for death. "Hide them all, then," he demands of Dumbledore in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. "Keep them, safe, please." But never once does he say, "I gave Voldemort the information that led to this." Instead, he detaches himself from the consequence, begging for help like a desperate man, not like one seeking redemption. This refusal to acknowledge his part continues in his treatment of Harry. Time and again, he punishes the boy for the sins of the father. Harry, just 11 years old, meets a potions master who glares at him with barely concealed hatred. In Philosopher's Stone, Snape says coldly, "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death, if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." The venom in his voice is unmistakable. It's not a challenge to students. It's a dagger aimed at one child in particular. Yet never does Snape stop to think this boy is innocent. He did not choose to be James Potter's son. Harry did not ask to look like James and carry Lily's eyes. And while Snape's grief may run deep, it does not excuse the way he lets that pain become cruelty. Even Dumbledore, who trusted Snape so completely, saw this flaw. "You see what you expect to see, Severus," he tells him in Half-Blood Prince. Other teachers report that the boy is modest, likable, and reasonably talented. Personally, I find him an engaging child. Still, Snape cannot or will not see Harry as his own person. He clings to the belief that Harry is arrogant, just as James was, and lets that belief excuse his own behavior. He refuses to examine the source of his bitterness. Never once does he apologize to Harry, not when he saves his life, not when he discovers Harry's loyalty, not when he knows his own time is short. Even his final moments are marked by silence. In Deathly Hallows, when Snape lies dying in the Shrieking Shack, blood spilling from his neck, his final request is not a confession, but an emotional deflection. "Look at me," he whispers. "Not forgive me, not I'm sorry." Just a plea to see Lily's eyes one last time. And yes, it's a heartbreaking moment, but it's also a telling one. Even in death, Snape chooses to shield himself with sentiment rather than seek absolution. Compare this to characters who do acknowledge their failings. Take Sirius Black, for instance. Reckless and hot-headed, Sirius recognizes his mistake in goading Snape toward the Shrieking Shack as a boy, a prank that could have ended in death. When the truth of this is revealed in Prisoner of Azkaban, Sirius says quietly, "I was 16 and I made a mistake." It's not a perfect apology, but it's a start. He owns it. He looks it in the eye. Remus Lupin, too, shows more humility than Snape ever does. In Deathly Hallows, when he briefly flees Tonks and their unborn child, afraid he's unfit to be a father, he is called out by Harry, and he listens. Lupin admits he was wrong, returns to Tonks, and stands with her in the Battle of Hogwarts, a man willing to change, a man willing to grow. Snape? Snape builds a wall of silence and sarcasm. When Harry confronts him in Order of the Phoenix about why he seems to hate him so much, Snape hisses, "You dared use my own spells against me, Potter. It was I who invented them." It's not a defense, it's a distraction. He changes the subject, hides behind pride. Pride is his armor, his mask, his curse. Even in his role as a double agent, Snape is fueled more by obsession than by conscience. He protects Harry because he made a promise to Dumbledore to keep an eye on the boy, as he phrases it. Not because he believes in Harry. Not because he respects him. Even as he risks everything, he never grants Harry the dignity of seeing him as a human being rather than a ghost of the past. And this failure to admit fault warps every relationship he has with his students, especially Neville Longbottom, whom he terrifies for no justifiable reason. Neville's boggart turns into Professor Snape. What does that say about the kind of teacher he was? To provoke that kind of fear in a child, a good man or even a merely decent one would reflect on that, would question what he's become. Snape does not. Number 18, allowed Slytherins to bully others. It was not just favoritism. It was a quiet war. In the stone corridors of Hogwarts, the halls that echoed with laughter, secrets, and ancient magic, there also lingered something darker. It was in the way Draco Malfoy strutted through the dungeons, flanked by Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle like a prince with his dull but loyal hounds. It was in the cold glance Professor Severus Snape gave to anyone outside his own house, as if they weren't worth the air they breathed. But worst of all, it was in the silence. The silence when Neville Longbottom trembled, the silence when Luna Lovegood was ridiculed, the silence when Hermione Granger, brilliant and brave, was called a slur. Mudblood. And the one adult in the room who could have spoken did not. Snape was the head of Slytherin, yes, but he was also a teacher. And teachers, in the eyes of children, are more than mere educators. They are protectors, judges, the final authority between justice and chaos. Yet for years, Severus Snape turned away when the students under his care, the Slytherins, tormented others. He watched, he knew, and he did nothing. Consider Draco Malfoy, a boy with a mouth too sharp for his years, raised with a sense of entitlement and poisoned pride. He sneered at Hufflepuffs, ridiculed Ravenclaws, but saved his most venomous taunts for Gryffindors. "Longbottom, why don't you just drop out?" he would smirk, his cronies snickering behind him. Neville, who already battled insecurities and a wand that barely listened to him, would grow pale, clutching his books like shields. And Snape, he'd pass by as if nothing had happened, or worse, reward Draco points for a well-brewed potion the very next day. A reward not for skill but for allegiance. Hermione Granger was another frequent target. In the Chamber of Secrets, Draco spits the word mudblood with such casual cruelty that Ron Weasley tries to curse him, only for the spell to backfire. And Snape, he witnesses the aftermath, interrogates Ron, but doesn't so much as acknowledge the insult. The word that cuts to the very bone of Hermione's identity, her existence, was ignored. It would have taken only one sentence from him to say that such language was not tolerated at Hogwarts. But he didn't. Not once. Then there was Luna Lovegood. Strange, dreamy, and wonderfully herself, Luna was used to being called loony. She floated through the castle with raddish earrings and a far-off smile, but even she wasn't immune to the Slytherin claws. In Order of the Phoenix, when Luna joins Dumbledore's army, the Slytherins are merciless. They steal her belongings, hide her shoes, and mock her beliefs in magical creatures. Snape, who prowled the castle like a predator, surely noticed, but said nothing. His silence was thunderous. Snape's treatment of Neville Longbottom is perhaps the most glaring example of his hypocrisy. Not only did he fail to protect Neville from Slytherin bullies, he himself became one. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Snape openly mocks Neville in front of the class, saying, "Why do you have all the emotional range of a teaspoon?" When the boggart transforms into Snape, Neville's greatest fear, Snape is humiliated, but the deeper truth is this: for a child to fear a teacher more than Death Eaters, more than failing, more than monsters, that says everything. Even more disturbing is how Snape reacted to the boggart incident. He didn't approach Neville afterward, he didn't reflect, he didn't apologize. Instead, he reinforced the power dynamic, punishing Neville more severely in subsequent lessons. It was as if the revelation that a child feared him gave Snape satisfaction, not shame. Some defenders of Snape say he had to maintain his cover as a double agent, that he couldn't be too kind. But this wasn't about secret missions or Voldemort, it was about children. The years before Voldemort returned, when Hogwarts was just a school, Snape still played favourites. He still punished Gryffindors for minor infractions and let Slytherins run free. Remember when Harry and Ron flew the car to school and crashed into the Whomping Willow? Snape wanted them expelled. Yet when Draco hexed other students in the corridors, nothing happened. It wasn't just inaction, it was encouragement. In Goblet of Fire, when Draco is mocking Harry about his scar and Cedric Diggory's victory, Snape overhears it all. Does he intervene? No. Instead, he gives Harry detention for speaking back. Malfoy walks away smirking, untouched. This imbalance taught the Slytherins that cruelty was currency, that they could rise by stepping on others. There was a quiet sort of terror in that dungeon classroom. Gryffindors sat tensely, knowing that one misstep could earn them a sneer or worse. When Hermione raised her hand, too often, too eagerly, Snape would ignore her, or worse, belittle her. "Obviously," he'd say with a curl of the lip, when she answered correctly. It wasn't just bias, it was the shaping of power structures. By undermining the brightest girl in the room, he gave his housemates permission to mock her too. Even Harry, though not always the victim of bullying, saw how Snape's favoritism emboldened the Slytherins. In Half-Blood Prince, after Katie Bell is cursed by the necklace, Draco is suspected, but Snape protects him. He knows Draco is involved in something dangerous, but shields him under the guise of a promise to Narcissa. Again, protecting one Slytherin at the cost of many others. His loyalty was not to justice. It was to the house he ruled like a bitter king. There were moments when Snape had the opportunity to stand up, not as a spy, not as a bitter man, but as a teacher. When students laughed at Luna's beliefs, he could have defended intellectual freedom. When Draco called Hermione a mudblood, he could have punished hate speech. When Neville quaked under his gaze, he could have softened. He did none of these things. In the world of children, adults who stay silent are complicit, and Severus Snape was the loudest silence of all. Some argue he was fair to all students, but the evidence says otherwise. When Gryffindors lost points, it was swift and public. When Slytherins cheated, it was overlooked. In Sorcerer's Stone, when Harry catches Draco trying to hex Neville behind his back during flying lessons, Madam Hooch isn't there. But Snape is later told, and nothing happens. Instead, he confiscates Harry's broom for daring to fly without permission. Not Draco's wand, not his points, only punishment for Gryffindor. The result was predictable. Slytherins became more emboldened, their taunts sharper, their hexes crueler. Students like Pansy Parkinson laughed openly at Hermione's hair, at Neville's clumsiness, at Luna's dreams. "She looks like she's been attacked by a flock of crows," Pansy once said about Hermione. Snape, in the same room, didn't bat an eye. And what message did that send? That cruelty was clever, that mocking others was power, that as long as you wore green and silver, you could be untouchable. The final blow comes in Order of the Phoenix, when Snape refuses to teach Harry occlumency properly. Instead of patience, he uses cruelty. Instead of guidance, sarcasm. He uses Harry's worst memories against him, mocks his pain, and when Harry sees the truth about Snape's own childhood, Snape explodes, not out of regret, but because Harry saw behind the mask. It wasn't the look of a man who cared about protecting students. It was the look of a man who hated being vulnerable. And it was in that hatred that he let others suffer. A good teacher does more than deliver lessons. A good teacher protects the weak, defends the voiceless, and punishes the unjust. Snape failed on all three counts. He saw the cruelty, the bullying, the emotional wounds carved into students year after year, and let it continue. Not because he couldn't stop it, but because deep down he didn't want to. Perhaps it reminded him of his own past, of being bullied by James and Sirius. But where others might have broken the cycle, Snape became the very thing he once feared. A man with power who used it not to heal, but to wound. So when people call Snape a hero, they must not forget this side of him. Yes, he played a vital role in the war. Yes, he protected Harry in the end. But for 7 years he failed the very children he was supposed to guide. He allowed Slytherins to torment others, and worse, he taught them how. The legacy of a teacher is not only in what they do, but in what they tolerate. Severus Snape, for all his complexity, tolerated cruelty, and for that many students walked the halls of Hogwarts not in wonder, but in fear. Number 19 was cruel to house elves. Severus Snape, a man of many contradictions, has been praised and vilified in equal measure. But amidst the endless debates over his heroism or villainy, there lies a subtle, often overlooked aspect of his character, his treatment of those beneath him in the social hierarchy of the wizarding world. Specifically his cruelty toward house elves, a cruelty that, though not always loudly broadcast, reveals a great deal about the core of who he was. It's a quiet scene, barely noticeable unless one is looking closely. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the kitchens of Hogwarts are finally introduced to readers. Harry, Ron, and Hermione discover them hidden behind a painting of a fruit bowl. Inside, dozens of house elves bustle about preparing food and cleaning with delighted enthusiasm. When Hermione begins her campaign for elf rights, SPEW, many scoff at her idealism, but she notices what few others care to see. That kindness toward the enslaved creatures is exceedingly rare, even among respected wizards. Among those most indifferent is Professor Snape. It is easy to imagine that Snape, in his dark robes and bitter demeanor, would not concern himself with the welfare of magical creatures. But indifference is one thing. Active cruelty is another. There is a scene, albeit brief and buried in the pages, that hints at Snape's attitude. In Order of the Phoenix, when Dobby is helping Harry find the Room of Requirement, Snape storms past them in a corridor. "Get out of the way, you filthy creature," he snaps, his voice like a whip. Dobby flinches but does not protest. He has heard such words before from worse mouths, but it is no less painful. Snape's dismissal of Dobby is no passing irritability. Dobby, the free elf who serves Hogwarts out of loyalty, is one of the most kind-hearted characters in the entire series. He is helpful, brave, and devoted to Harry Potter. To treat such a being with contempt requires either a total disregard for kindness or a deep-seated belief in one's superiority. Snape's behavior becomes even more telling when we compare it to the attitudes of other characters. Albus Dumbledore, for instance, is unfailingly polite to house elves. In Goblet of Fire, he insists on treating Winky with respect, even as she spirals into despair. "You may leave, Dobby," Dumbledore says gently on another occasion. He does not raise his voice nor speak as if to a lesser being. In contrast, Snape's tone toward Dobby is clipped, sharp, and utterly void of compassion. This disparity reveals something troubling. Snape, for all his intelligence and bravery, reserves his decency only for those he deems worthy. Lily Evans, the woman he loved, she received his gentlest words and deepest regrets. Draco Malfoy, his Slytherin protégé, he earned Snape's protection. But house elves, they were beneath notice. And if they happened to cross his path, they were met not with indifference, but open scorn. One might argue that Snape's hostility was merely part of his role as a double agent, a persona crafted to deceive Death Eaters and protect his secrets. But the truth is more bitter than that. His disdain for house elves was not strategic. It was natural. Not once in the 7 books does Snape express concern for their treatment. He never challenges their servitude, never questions their conditions, never lifts a finger to help them. And consider Kreacher, the surly elf who serves at 12 Grimmauld Place. Even he, with all his flaws and vitriol, receives more sympathy from characters like Harry than from Snape. Harry, who once loathed Kreacher, comes to understand him after witnessing the memories of his suffering. He begins to treat him with gentleness. "Thank you, Kreacher," he says sincerely in Deathly Hallows. These words change Kreacher's behavior entirely. Kindness transforms him, but from Snape, Kreacher receives nothing but cold stares and silence. There is a scene during one of the Order of the Phoenix's meetings in the kitchen of Grimmauld Place. Kreacher shuffles by, muttering under his breath about blood traitors and mudbloods. Molly Weasley hushes him with maternal patience. Sirius, though cruel himself, at least engages, but Snape? He doesn't even see Kreacher. His eyes slide past the elf like one would ignore a rat in the corner. This reveals a deeper rot within Snape's soul, one that no amount of bravery can cleanse. A truly good man does not reserve his kindness for a chosen few. He shows it to the weak, the voiceless, the invisible. Snape, tragically, could not. The moment that best encapsulates Snape's coldness comes not from the pages of a book, but from what is not there. In Half-Blood Prince, when Dobby is sent by Harry to follow Malfoy, we see no mention of Snape's interaction with the elf, despite their overlapping goals. Snape knew of Malfoy's secret missions and surely knew of the elf's involvement, yet he never acknowledges Dobby, never comments on his role, never offers the smallest measure of thanks. Even when Dobby dies, a death that shatters Harry's heart, Snape shows no reaction. Of course, by that point he is busy playing his dangerous game of deception, but the truth is, even had he known, it is unlikely he would have cared. Dobby's sacrifice would have meant nothing to him. Some may protest that Snape was a man at war, fighting his demons, his regrets, his past. And this is true, but war does not excuse cruelty. If anything, it demands more compassion. More than anyone, Snape should have understood what it means to be an outcast, a servant, a pawn in someone else's game. And yet, when presented with creatures who embodied all these traits, he looked away. Snape's lack of empathy for house elves stands in stark contrast to Hermione Granger. She, a Muggle-born girl with no house elf heritage or obligation, campaigns tirelessly for their freedom. She brings food to the kitchens, speaks to them gently, argues for their rights, even when ridiculed. "Just because they don't complain doesn't mean they're happy," she says in Goblet of Fire, her voice trembling with passion. That Snape, a half-blood who suffered at the hands of others for his status, could not muster the same empathy, is perhaps his greatest failure. He, who knew what it meant to be scorned, still chose to scorn others. Even Voldemort, monstrous as he was, used house elves as tools rather than tormenting them needlessly. Bellatrix tortured them, Lucius abused them. But Snape, For all his supposed distance from Death Eater ideology mirrored their disdain in his everyday behavior. In Chamber of Secrets, when Dobby is punished by Lucius Malfoy, it is Harry who defends him. "You shouldn't have hit him," Harry says, outraged. Snape, had he witnessed such a scene, would likely have said nothing, or worse, justified it. The way we treat those without power says more about us than how we treat our equals. And Snape, time and again, fails this test. His treatment of house elves reveals a man who cannot see worth unless it mirrors his own ambition or suffering. He can cry for Lily, fight for Harry, protect Draco, but he cannot stoop to see the humanity in those who serve beneath his notice. A house elf like Dobby, full of life and courage, deserved better. He saved Harry's life more than once. He stood up to Death Eaters, betrayed no secrets, and died with Harry Potter's name on his lips. "Such a beautiful place to be with friends," Dobby whispered as he died. A hero's farewell. Would Snape have knelt beside him? Would he have cared? The silence speaks louder than words. And so we must ask, can a man truly be redeemed if his heart holds warmth only for a select few? If he cannot see the value in a creature like Dobby, what does that say of his soul? Snape's story is one of sacrifice and pain, but also of limitation. His love was fierce but narrow, his courage was great but incomplete, and his kindness, when it came at all, was gated tightly behind personal loss. The tragedy of Severus Snape is not merely in what he suffered, but in what he refused to learn. He who had every reason to understand pain never truly embraced compassion. And in the quiet corridors of Hogwarts, where house elves labor without thanks, his absence of empathy echoes louder than any of his spells. Number 20. Showed contempt for Muggles. Severus Snape stood in the defense against the dark arts classroom. His black eyes narrowed as he observed a group of fourth-year Gryffindors struggle with a simple hex reversal charm. "Pathetic," he murmured, barely audibly. But Hermione Granger, ever attentive, caught the word. She stiffened, but said nothing. Snape's lips curled, and he added with distinct disdain, "Even a Muggle could muster more concentration than this." The room fell silent, the insult hanging in the air like a cold mist. It was not the first time he used the word Muggle in such a manner, not as a factual descriptor, but as a slur. And it would not be the last. Snape's loathing of Muggles was not as overt as that of Bellatrix Lestrange or Lucius Malfoy, but it was rooted just as deeply. It was more subtle, more insidious, revealing itself in word choices, glances, and veiled sarcasm. Although he had long since abandoned the cause of Voldemort and pledged loyalty to Albus Dumbledore, Snape never unlearned the prejudice that had been drilled into him during his youth in the ranks of the Death Eaters. One might argue that he was simply a product of his environment, but that argument does not erase the contempt that bled through his every interaction with Muggle-borns and with those who dared speak kindly of Muggles. Even in his youth, Snape gravitated toward the dark corners of ideology. In his 5th year at Hogwarts, he had already begun using the term mudblood, the cruel slur that turned Lily Evans's face pale and disgusted. When she confronted him after the infamous incident by the lake, after James Potter had humiliated him, his apology was not for using the slur, but for letting it slip. "I'm sorry," he'd said, desperate. "I didn't mean it." But Lily had answered with bitter clarity, "You call everyone of my birth mudblood, Severus. Why should I be any different?" This moment marked not only the beginning of the end of their friendship, but also the revelation of a prejudice Snape never fully outgrew. Years later, as a professor at Hogwarts, Snape rarely if ever used the word mudblood aloud. But the venom lingered in his voice when he addressed Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age and a Muggle-born. Know-it-all, he sneered in nearly every class, ignoring the outbursts of others, punishing her for what he perceived as insolence. He never praised her, never recognized her discipline or talent. Was it simply her rule-following he resented? Or was it something deeper, something born of his own internalized contempt? Snape's prejudice was not blind hatred, it was selective. He tolerated those who proved useful or exceptional, but even then, his regard was poisoned by classism and ancestral pride. His respect for Lily Evans was built on affection and shared brilliance, not acceptance of her Muggle-born status. It was an exception that proved the rule. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, he called her a brilliant witch, but never once did he acknowledge that her Muggle lineage made her accomplishments more remarkable. His silence was damning. Even more telling was his treatment of students who came from Muggle families. Dean Thomas, a Muggle-born Gryffindor, was often ignored or dismissed during lessons. When he mispronounced a potion ingredient in his third year, Snape didn't correct him gently. Instead, he rolled his eyes and barked, "Perhaps you should return to the world of football and leave potions to those with some talent." It wasn't just a jab, it was a statement loaded with cultural disdain, a reminder that Dean was, in Snape's eyes, from a lesser world. One might expect that Snape's own background would soften his stance. After all, his father, Tobias Snape, was a Muggle, a cruel and neglectful one at that. Young Severus grew up in a bleak industrial neighborhood in Spinner's End, and the bitterness of that upbringing clung to him like soot. But instead of drawing compassion from this experience, Snape turned it inward, letting it fester into shame and hatred. He associated Muggles not with humanity, but with pain, weakness, and failure. This bitterness may explain, but it cannot justify. When teaching Harry Potter, he often invoked the boy's arrogant father, yet the way he spoke about Lily, always filtered through personal anguish, never included acknowledgement of her heritage. In The Half-Blood Prince, when Snape offered to protect the Potters in exchange for Voldemort sparing Lily, he made no mention of Harry or James. "Hide them all, then," he told Dumbledore. "Keep her. The others mean nothing." It wasn't just jealousy, it was disdain for the bloodline of James Potter, whom he saw as the embodiment of everything elitist and undeserved. And Harry, the half-blood child of that union, was caught in the crossfire of that resentment. Snape's attitude toward Arthur Weasley further illustrates his biases. Arthur, though a pureblood, had a deep fascination and admiration for Muggle life. He collected plugs and batteries and worked in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office. Snape routinely mocked him for it, sneering at his interests. "That office exists only because of your father's pathetic obsession," he once told Ron Weasley, with the kind of venom that far exceeded casual teasing. To Snape, Arthur's respect for Muggles was a weakness, a betrayal of magical heritage. His alliance with Dumbledore did little to change these sentiments. Though Dumbledore demanded tolerance, even love, Snape's agreement was strategic, not moral. He protected students, yes, but often grudgingly, and never with warmth. When Dumbledore insisted that he assist with Harry's occlumency lessons, Snape agreed out of obligation. He made no effort to hide his contempt, turning the sessions into emotional minefields. Harry described them as torture. And though his motivations were tangled with grief and duty, Snape's disdain for the boy's Muggle upbringing was always beneath the surface. His language betrayed him. The word Muggle dripped from his tongue like acid. He used it not in the neutral tone of Dumbledore or Hagrid, but in the same cold register as Lucius Malfoy. His insults often leaned on the cultural divide between the magical and non-magical worlds. "It's not your fault," he once snapped at Seamus Finnegan, "that your mother didn't raise you with a wand in hand." The comment stung because it struck at identity. not just ability. There were moments, fleeting and rare, where Snape's mask faltered. In the Deathly Hallows, when he sends the Silver Doe to guide Harry to the sword of Gryffindor, there is a sense of quiet redemption. But even then, his act is born of love for Lily, not belief in equality. He did not do it for the Muggleborns, nor for the Muggles suffering under Voldemort's new regime. His was a personal vendetta wrapped in sacrifice, not a moral epiphany. Dolores Umbridge, another cruel authority figure at Hogwarts, shared many of Snape's prejudices, yet even she dressed them in bureaucracy. Snape's version was more personal, more cutting. When he refused to help Harry brew the antidote for Ron's poisoning in The Half-Blood Prince, it wasn't just about rules, it was about control. He viewed Harry not only as arrogant, but as tainted, his father's son, half-Muggle, raised in a world Snape disdained. Snape also opposed the idea of teaching Muggle studies and openly ridiculed the subject. When Charity Burbage, the professor of Muggle studies, was murdered by Voldemort, Snape said nothing. He sat silent at the table, offering no defense. It was a chilling moment. Perhaps he was undercover, playing a role, but even a flicker of emotion might have suggested regret. There was none. The silence was his verdict. In the Philosopher's Stone, during the sorting ceremony, Snape's eyes never lingered on the Muggleborns. He gravitated toward those with names he recognized, scion of old houses, children of former allies. He evaluated them not by merit, but by legacy. It was not only a Slytherin trait, it was a personal conviction shaped by years of ideological rot. In private conversations, especially those recorded by pensive memories, Snape never questioned the ideology of blood purity. He rejected Voldemort's methods, not necessarily his doctrine. His motivations were always about Lily, never about justice. He wanted revenge. He wanted reparation. He wanted memory, but equality? He never spoke of it. Snape's hatred of his own father Tobias may have fueled this. Tobias was violent, angry, and indifferent to Severus's magical talent. Snape learned to associate Muggles with suppression and shame. It twisted into a rejection of that part of himself. When he took the name Half-Blood Prince, it was a deliberate severing of identity. He was not Tobias's son, he was Prince, a pure name, a powerful one. He discarded the Muggle and embraced the wizard, even if that meant contempt for the world that birthed him. And yet, the tragedy of Snape is that he could never escape this contradiction. He loved a Muggle-born, but hated her world. He fought for the side of light, but carried the darkness within. His soul was split, not by Horcruxes, but by prejudice, and it showed in every glance, every sneer, every bitter word. When Harry looked into the pensieve and saw Snape's memories, he saw a man in pain, a man who suffered. But suffering does not excuse hatred, it explains it. And in the end, Snape died a hero, but not a saint. His legacy is marked not only by bravery, but by the stains he never washed clean. Perhaps the final truth lies in Dumbledore's words, spoken softly in the Deathly Hallows. You are a brave man, Severus. But never once did he call him kind. Number 21. Used legilimency on students. The dungeon classroom was always cold, always dim. The flickering torchlight on the stone walls danced like restless shadows, appropriate for a lesson where minds would be laid bare. Harry Potter stood in the centre of the room, wand in hand, heart pounding in his ears. He already knew what was coming, and he dreaded it more than any hex or jinx. It was not the kind of lesson one prepared for with textbooks. No, this was a lesson in pain, in violation, in humiliation. "Clear your mind, Potter," came the low, cold voice of Professor Severus Snape. Harry tried. He closed his eyes for a second, pushed away the images, the graveyard, the screaming, the green light, but they clung to his thoughts like burrs. He opened his eyes again.
Legilimens!
It came without warning, as always. There was never a moment of choice. The force of Snape's magic hit him like a floodgate, crashing open. The walls Harry tried to build in his mind fell away in an instant, and his memories spilled forth like loose pages in a storm. There was Dudley chasing him with a stick, while Aunt Petunia shouted from the window, a cupboard, a birthday cake drawn in the dirt. Harry tried to push him out, but the spell was relentless. Snape's face remained unreadable, but something sharp glinted in his eyes. Was it cruelty? Contempt? He didn't stop. He didn't care.
Did I not tell you to clear your mind? Snape snarled.
Harry stumbled backward, chest heaving. You don't give me time, he shouted. Snape didn't respond. He simply raised his wand again. Legilimens! The onslaught continued. There was Cho crying in the room of requirement. There was Sirius falling through the veil. And there was Ginny lying motionless in the chamber of secrets. Snape saw it all, every fear, every shame, every wound. Harry felt stripped of all dignity. No teacher had ever treated him like this. No one had dared to treat his memories, his trauma, as something to sift through like a drawer of misplaced belongings. But Snape did, repeatedly, without remorse. This was not education, this was invasion. It was supposed to be occlumency, a defense against mental intrusion, but the irony was sickening. In teaching Harry to defend himself from Lord Voldemort, Snape had become Voldemort in miniature, piercing into Harry's soul without permission, without compassion, and without care for the scars he left behind. You do not control the situation, Snape said once. I do.
And he did. He controlled the room, the pace, the tone. He never explained, never softened. There was no consent, no gentleness, just orders and pain.
The worst part wasn't the spell itself. It was the way Snape responded to what he found.
I see you crying over a mudblood girl in a diary, he sneered once. Is that supposed to be tragic?
Harry's hands balled into fists. The memory of Ginny in the chamber wasn't just a moment, it was a wound. To have it mocked, reduced to a footnote in Snape's contempt, was unbearable.
You think your mind is a fortress, Snape mocked. It's a broken window.
What kind of teacher does that to a child? Dumbledore had trusted Snape to protect Harry, but here, in this dank classroom, the boy wasn't protected. He was dissected. The text makes it clear. In Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 24, J.K. Rowling writes, "The spell hit Harry so hard he was knocked backward into the shelves. His head hit the stone wall. He felt something wet trickle down the back of his neck." It wasn't just mental violation, it was physical. There was nothing metaphorical about the damage. And it happened again. And again. There was no safe word, no escape. At one point, Harry begged him, "You don't understand what it's like in my head." Snape looked at him with eyes colder than the stone floor. "You think I care?" Perhaps he didn't. Or perhaps he cared only enough to hurt, enough to punish. The worst came when Snape dug too deep, when he reached a memory not of pain, but of joy. Harry saw his parents in a haze of memory, smiling, happy, together. And then Snape was there, watching it too. His intrusion made the moment feel dirty, corrupted. Harry shouted, "Get out!" with every ounce of magic in him. Snape's wand fell. For a moment he looked not guilty, but disturbed, perhaps even angry at himself. But it passed quickly. His mask returned. "You're weak, Potter," he said simply. It was always like that. The lectures were cruel, the tone was belittling, and the effect was cumulative. After each lesson, Harry felt less like a student and more like a victim. He would stumble to bed, exhausted, shaking. Sometimes he would cry, quietly behind the curtains of his bed where no one could hear. Ron never understood why Harry looked so hollow. Hermione knew something was wrong, but even she didn't grasp the full extent. Harry couldn't tell them. Who would believe him? Even when Harry found the pensieve and watched Snape's most humiliating memory, the boy didn't retaliate. He could have used it to humiliate Snape in turn, but he didn't. That difference mattered because Harry had empathy. Snape didn't. Let us not forget, Harry was 15, a child, a boy haunted by Voldemort, by Cedric's death, by nightmares that bled into his waking life. And instead of care, instead of guidance, he got a man who weaponized his pain. And what did Dumbledore do? Nothing. The silence of the headmaster was complicity. He gave Snape this responsibility, knowing the bitterness that rotted between them, and did nothing to mediate. To this day, many say Snape was a hero, that he suffered, that he loved Lily, but love without kindness is poison, and heroism does not excuse cruelty to children. Snape's fans often argue he had to be cruel. It was the only way to teach him. But is that really true? Couldn't Lupin have taught occlumency, or Dumbledore himself? And even if Snape was the only option, did he have to mock Harry's memories? Did he have to use legilimency like a whip? Even Voldemort gave warnings before he attacked. Harry's sense of privacy was already fragile. His whole life had been an open wound, and Snape, instead of bandaging it, poured salt inside. A good man, any good man, would never do that. Snape's hatred of James clouded everything. He didn't see Harry. He saw a shadow of the past, a ghost he could punish over and over again. At one point, Harry yelled, "You're not teaching me, you're hurting me!" Snape ignored it. Because he didn't see the boy, he saw only a mirror. And when Snape walked away from those sessions, he felt justified, perhaps even pleased. But Harry? He felt broken. The emotional abuse Harry suffered during those lessons is rarely acknowledged, but it mattered. It was trauma. It was deep. By the end of that year, Harry had nightmares not just of Voldemort, but of Snape. The faces blended together. The pain was indistinguishable. And perhaps that was the final irony. In trying to protect Harry from the Dark Lord, Snape became indistinguishable from him. There was a moment, one brief moment, when Snape looked into Harry's eyes and paused. Something flickered, maybe recognition, maybe guilt, but he said nothing, did nothing. And that moment passed. Years later, Harry would name his son after Snape. But some wounds don't heal no matter what names are given, because legilimency without consent is not magic, it's assault. And no amount of posthumous redemption can erase the fact that Severus Snape looked into a child's soul and sneered. Number 22, mocked Tonks's grief. In the cold, dimly lit kitchen of number 12, Grimmauld Place, a thick silence settled over the members of the Order of the Phoenix. The air was heavy with mourning. Sirius Black, the man who had offered his ancestral home as a sanctuary for the Order, had fallen through the veil at the Department of Mysteries. He was gone. No body to bury, no farewell to whisper. Just absence. Dark, suffocating absence. Among those who grieved, Nymphadora Tonks suffered perhaps more deeply than most. Her usually vibrant hair had faded to a mousy brown, a reflection of her spirit, dulled and broken. And in the midst of this collective sorrow, Severus Snape, true to form, pierced the silence not with comfort, but with cruelty. Tonks had always admired Sirius. As his younger cousin, she had grown up hearing fragments about the infamous Black family, the blood traitors, the rebels, the mad. But Sirius had stood apart. He had chosen the light. And though he spent over a decade in Azkaban, when he returned, Tonks had found a kindred spirit in him, someone brave, flawed, and fiercely loyal. Their relationship wasn't romantic, but it was deeply emotional, woven with family, resilience, and shared cause. His death hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her world. And for Snape to twist the knife in such a moment, it was more than cruel. It was calculated. "You're letting your emotions get the better of you," Snape said dryly, standing near the long kitchen table, arms crossed. "Your current state makes you of little use to the Order." He didn't shout. He didn't sneer. His voice was smooth, cool as ice, but every word landed like a slap. Remus Lupin looked up, his face pale with restrained anger. Tonks stared at the table, eyes glistening, knuckles white from clenching her wand. This wasn't a moment of tension in battle where sharp words might slip. This was intentional. Snape saw vulnerability, and he pounced. Tonks, for all her clumsiness and playful spirit, was one of the Order's most devoted members. She risked her life daily as an Auror, often working in dangerous conditions under the watchful eye of the corrupt ministry. After Sirius's death, she didn't run, she didn't hide. She continued her duties, though the light in her had dimmed. Her hair no longer shifted colors with her mood. It remained dull, lifeless, as though the joy had been drained from her entirely. J.K. Rowling describes her transformation in Half-Blood Prince. Her hair was a washed-out, mousy brown, and her face, usually animated, looked drawn and tired. That change wasn't superficial. It was grief embodied, and Snape knew exactly what it meant. It is easy to imagine that Snape, himself steeped in grief over Lily Evans for years, would understand. But this was the twisted irony. He, who lived shackled to the memory of a lost love, showed no mercy to someone else mourning someone they loved. Perhaps it was projection. Perhaps he couldn't stand to see someone wear their grief so openly when he had spent decades burying his, still to mock Tonks for it. That wasn't mere bitterness. That was cruelty. It wasn't just about her. It was about control, about dominance. Snape had long been the Order's outsider, their reluctant ally. He didn't command loyalty with warmth or kindness. He used words like daggers, and with Tonks he plunged deep. There's a disturbing contrast here. Snape, who we later learn had protected Harry out of love for Lily, could not extend even the smallest kindness to someone broken by the loss of family. Tonks hadn't wronged him. She wasn't his enemy. Yet in her pain he saw weakness, and he scorned it. We see this repeated in the way he addresses her to Dumbledore, coldly saying, "I notice you've adopted a new and more mournful style. You're losing your nerve." It was not a question. It was an accusation. Dumbledore doesn't defend her. No one does. This moment reveals how Tonks, despite her service, was often left to carry her pain alone. Was it jealousy on Snape's part? Tonks was young, bright, emotionally open, everything he was not. Maybe he resented the way she wore her heart on her sleeve, how she had people who cared for her, including Remus. Maybe Sirius's death had affected him more than he let on. They had been enemies after all, but also brothers in arms in the Order. Could Snape's attack have been a displaced form of grief, a venomous defense mechanism? Perhaps, but intent doesn't erase impact. The fact remains, Tonks was grieving. And Snape, with full awareness of that grief, sought to minimize her, humiliate her. His remark that she was no longer useful is more than rude, it's dehumanizing. He reduced her worth to her function, erasing her pain in favor of cold practicality. It speaks volumes about how Snape viewed people around him, as tools, either sharp and effective or dull and discarded. What makes this moment even more significant is the way it undermines the common narrative of Snape as a misunderstood hero. Yes, he risked his life for the Order. Yes, he ultimately served the cause of good. But goodness is not measured in outcomes alone. It is also found in how we treat others. And in this moment, Snape failed utterly. Tonks, despite everything, rose above it. She eventually found love with Remus, pushed through the weight of grief, and continued to fight for the Order. She died a hero. But her pain during that period was real, and Snape made it worse. We often romanticize Snape's sarcasm, treating it as dark wit or anti-hero charm. But here, it stripped away all illusion. This wasn't cleverness, this was emotional violence. And it wasn't the only time he struck like this. He had a pattern of wielding words as weapons, often against those least able to fight back. Even Harry noticed Tonks's misery, observing in Half-Blood Prince. She looked drawn and pale, and her hair had yet to regain its usual hue. It was visible to everyone, except, apparently, to the man who claimed to understand loss better than anyone. Imagine for a moment Tonks's perspective. She's sitting among allies. She's already battling grief, self-doubt, and the fear of returning to a world without Sirius. And then comes Snape, not with encouragement, not with a nod of solidarity, but with a blade of judgment. That's not just insensitivity, it's emotional sabotage. Snape defenders often point to his double life as an excuse. He was under constant strain, they say. He had to maintain appearances, play both sides, but this moment didn't serve any mission. It wasn't for show, it was real, intimate cruelty, delivered in a place where she should have felt safe. The implications go further. By belittling Tonks in her grief, Snape contributed to the culture of silence around mourning in the wizarding world. It was a world at war, yes, but even in war, the heart needs space to ache. His words told her she was weak, useless, dispensable, but she wasn't. She was wounded. One could argue that Snape's own internalized pain warped his view, that he saw emotional expression as weakness because it was something he never allowed himself. But again, understanding why someone is cruel does not absolve the cruelty. Snape's dynamic with Sirius had always been hostile. Old-school grudges had hardened into lifelong contempt. But even so, mocking someone who mourned Sirius wasn't just about rivalry. It was about control, about lashing out at someone softer, more vulnerable. We can admire Snape's sacrifices, we can appreciate the complexity of his choices, but we must also acknowledge his darkness, not the performative darkness of a spy, but the quiet, personal darkness that lashes out in quiet rooms, that wounds without wands. Tonks never retaliated, she never lashed back. That silence speaks to her character and to her loneliness. In that moment, Snape didn't just insult her, he isolated her. He made her pains smaller in the eyes of others. This memory lingers because it's not about spells or battles, it's about the quiet moments in between, the way people treat each other when no one is watching. Snape failed that test, and no amount of posthumous redemption erases it. He wasn't just rude, he wasn't just sarcastic, he was cruel. And in the world of Harry Potter, where love is the ultimate magic, that cruelty matters. It leaves marks deeper than curses. So when we ask the question, was Snape a good man? We must look beyond the grand gestures. We must remember Tonks, sitting silently at that kitchen table, trying to hold herself together. We must remember the knife in Snape's words, and we must answer honestly.
Because in that moment he wasn't a hero, he wasn't a spy, he wasn't a man protecting a child in secret, he was a bully.
And the worst kind of bully is the one who strikes where it hurts most, in the name of pragmatism, wearing grief like a weakness and wielding silence like a sword. Number 23 abused his power as a teacher. Severus Snape's shadow fell long and cold across the stone corridors of Hogwarts. To many students, his presence meant dread, not guidance. The very moment a first year descended into the dungeons and found themselves seated before a cauldron, Snape was there, not as a mentor, but as a threat. His voice was silk, wrapped around thorns. When he spoke, it wasn't to uplift, but to cut. "There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class," he once said, with barely concealed disdain. "As such, many of you will hardly believe this is magic." From that opening remark, he established a reign not of respect, but of fear. Neville Longbottom, clumsy and wide-eyed, bore the brunt of Snape's cruelty. Time and again, the potions master humiliated him in front of his peers. During one lesson, when Neville's potion didn't thicken properly, Snape's voice rang out, "Why is it always Longbottom who's the first to mess things up?" The room fell silent. Neville's ears turned crimson. It wasn't just disappointment, it was mockery. Worse still, Snape once declared that Neville's worst fear was him, Snape himself. This was revealed during Professor Lupin's defense against the dark arts class, when a boggart, supposed to take the shape of what one fears most, transformed into Severus Snape. That alone speaks volumes. Snape had power, but he wielded it like a lash. He played favourites with a brazen disregard for fairness. Slytherin students could do little wrong in his eyes, while those from Gryffindor, especially those connected to James Potter, were treated like pests. Harry Potter was his particular target. In the Philosopher's Stone, Snape immediately singled him out. "Clearly fame isn't everything," he said, with a curl of the lip. And so began years of passive-aggressive slights, public embarrassment, and unjust punishments. Harry's only crime was bearing a striking resemblance to his father. Luna Lovegood, though less frequently mentioned in Snape's lessons, also drew the quiet scorn of authority figures like him. Though eccentric, Luna was a bright, brave student, yet people in power dismissed her as odd. Snape was no exception. He sneered at those who stood out, especially if they lacked social protection. It wasn't always what he said to students like Luna, it was what he didn't say. He didn't defend her when others laughed. He allowed mockery to exist in the room like a foul odour he secretly enjoyed. His treatment of Hermione Granger, one of the most brilliant students Hogwarts had seen in decades, was a cruel lesson in how genius can be punished when it comes in the wrong form. During one class, when Hermione eagerly offered an answer, Snape snarled, "You insufferable know-it-all," in front of everyone. A teacher mocking a student for academic enthusiasm, it was not a moment of discipline, but of control, of power used to humiliate. It was a dagger to her confidence, carefully sharpened and deliberately thrust. Even Draco Malfoy, Snape's favourite, was not truly nurtured. Favoritism is not mentorship. Snape didn't guide Draco toward goodness. He enabled his worst instincts, protected him from consequences, and indirectly fueled his arrogance. A real teacher tempers ambition with wisdom. Snape instead fortified Draco's superiority complex, reinforcing a hierarchy in which Slytherins ruled and others were nothing. During occlumency lessons in Order of the Phoenix, Snape's abuse took a deeper, more personal form. He invaded Harry's mind without consent or empathy, relishing in Harry's pain rather than helping him control it. When Harry, after weeks of torment, managed to access Snape's memories, he saw a teenage Severus being bullied by James Potter. The irony is not lost. Snape, once a victim of abuse, became a perpetrator. The very cruelty he had suffered, he now inflicted on the next generation. What makes Snape's conduct more damning is that he never sought redemption through his teaching. He never once apologized to a student, never once acknowledged the hurt he caused. Even his famed bravery, his double life as a spy, did not bleed into the classroom. There, he was not a protector. He was a tyrant. Albus Dumbledore knew of his cruelty, yet allowed it, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of necessity. But this allowance does not absolve Snape. It compounds the failure. In The Half-Blood Prince, Harry discovers Snape's own annotated potions textbook. The notes improve his skills dramatically, proof that Snape could have been a magnificent teacher had he chosen to uplift rather than suppress. His knowledge was vast, his mastery undeniable, but he used it as a weapon, not as a gift to share. One of the most chilling moments occurs in The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Snape tries to hand over Sirius Black to the Dementors, despite knowing Sirius might be innocent. He wasn't seeking justice, he was chasing vengeance. His obsession with past wrongs clouded his judgment, even when children's lives were at stake. A good man doesn't let grudges dictate their actions, especially not when standing in front of students. The role of a teacher is sacred. It's a position of profound trust. Children walk into the classroom with open minds, eager to learn. They do not come to be belittled, but Snape belittled. He tormented. He intimidated. He preyed on weakness. This is not sternness. This is not rigor. This is abuse of power. He docked points from Gryffindor for imagined infractions, while turning a blind eye to Slytherin misbehavior. He punished Neville for mistakes he had no time to fix, mocked Ron for his lack of elegance, and sneered at Harry's very existence. He ruled not with respect, but with fear. Even Filch, the caretaker, seemed less oppressive by comparison. At the Yule Ball, Snape patrolled the corridors looking for reasons to punish couples, enjoying a moment away from academic stress. He moved like a warden, not an educator. When he discovered a pair of students kissing, he snapped at them like they had committed treason. 10 points from Hufflepuff, he barked. There was no grace, no understanding, just immediate, joyless punishment. Snape's cruelty reached its zenith when he publicly humiliated students during class, ensuring that shame lingered long after the lesson ended. It wasn't enough to correct a mistake. He had to make an example of the student to assert dominance. During one particular class, after Ron's potion boiled over, Snape remarked coldly, "Why is your brain as empty as your cauldron?" That wasn't education. That was psychological warfare. In the Goblet of Fire, when Harry's name is pulled from the cup, Snape does not once consider the possibility of Harry being a victim. He glares, scowls, and retreats into silent condemnation. While others rally to Harry's defense, or at least question the anomaly, Snape assumes guilt, always punishment. It is telling that not a single student ever claimed to feel safe in Snape's presence. They respected his knowledge, perhaps, but not his heart, because it was closed off, locked in bitterness. And when your power is founded on fear, not respect, you are not a teacher, you are a tyrant in robes. Even in his final year at Hogwarts, acting as headmaster under Voldemort's regime, Snape did little to stop the Carrows, Death Eaters who tortured students. Only in secret did he protect them, never openly, never as a shield. He lived in the shadows, never confronting cruelty head-on in the daylight. Protection without comfort is only half a virtue. Snape's defenders often point to his sacrifice. They whisper, "But he loved Lily." And yes, he did, but love is not a license to hurt others. A broken heart does not justify a broken moral compass. Snape's pain was real, but so was the pain he inflicted. And for many students, that pain became part of their Hogwarts experience, one they could never forget. The tragedy of Severus Snape is not only that he suffered, but that he allowed his suffering to become a weapon. Rather than breaking the cycle, he perpetuated it. Rather than being the teacher he wished he had, he became the teacher he feared. And perhaps in the silence of the dungeons, he knew this, but knowing doesn't erase the damage. Severus Snape was many things: brave, brilliant, complex. But good? That is harder to say. For in every sneer, every insult, every unfair punishment, he chose to wield power, not as a balm, but as a blade. And those who suffered beneath it, Neville, Hermione, Harry, Luna, carry the scars still. Not all heroes wear shining armor, and not all villains are in the Dark Lord's service. Sometimes the deepest cruelty hides behind a black cloak in a classroom under the guise of education. Sometimes it is not the curse that wounds, but the words spoken by someone who should have known better. Snape knew better, but he chose otherwise. Number 24 did nothing to support Harry emotionally. When Harry Potter first set foot in the gloomy dungeons of Hogwarts to attend his very first potions class, he had no idea that the man standing at the front of the room, tall, greasy-haired and draped in black robes, would become one of the most psychologically tormenting figures in his life. Professor Severus Snape, a man sworn to protect Harry out of a promise to Albus Dumbledore, used that position not as an opportunity to ease the burden of an orphaned boy, but rather as a channel to project his bitterness, unresolved grief, and personal vendettas. Protection, yes, but kindness, compassion, not a shred. It is impossible to ignore Snape's sacrifices. He did without a doubt protect Harry. He sent warning messages. He risked his life as a double agent. But none of those noble actions ever translated into even the slightest act of comfort toward the boy. Not a kind word, not a look of understanding, not a single gesture that might have made Harry feel less alone in a world that had already taken everything from him. For every life-saving act Snape performed, he inflicted 10 more emotional wounds in return. And unlike curses and hexes, those wounds didn't leave scars, they left questions. Why? What did I ever do to him? In their very first interaction, Snape didn't simply dislike Harry, he humiliated him. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? Snape asked coldly, the words cutting through the silence like a knife. Harry, bewildered and unprepared, offered no answer. It was only the beginning of a long pattern of condescending questioning. Snape didn't want an answer. He wanted to assert dominance, to undermine Harry, to remind the boy daily that he was not welcome. Even in a classroom that was supposed to be a sanctuary of learning, Snape turned education into mockery. And what did Harry do to deserve such treatment? He existed. He looked like James Potter. He had his mother's eyes, 2 unforgivable crimes in Snape's deeply personal universe. Snape's love for Lily and hatred for James clashed violently inside him, and Harry became the living battlefield. It didn't matter that Harry never knew James, never had the chance to hurt or wrong Snape. It didn't matter that the boy had lived in a cupboard under the stairs for 10 years, unloved, unwanted. Snape looked at him and saw a mirror of his own past, and he shattered it again and again. The bullying was never subtle. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Snape took 5 points from Gryffindor because Harry and Ron were late to class, despite it being their first day, and them having gotten lost. When Neville Longbottom melted his cauldron, Snape punished Harry. "Why didn't you tell him not to add the quills?" he snarled. Not only was Harry innocent, he was being penalized for another student's mistake. And this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a system, a routine, a daily assault on Harry's self-worth. Students notice when a teacher plays favorites or wields authority unfairly. Ron and Hermione both saw it. Hermione, the ever-diligent student, repeatedly called Snape out for his unjust behavior. You asked us a question and he knew the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told? She snapped at one point, risking detention herself. Even Draco Malfoy, Snape's golden child, knew that he had a free pass to provoke Harry without fear of reprisal. The message was clear. You are not safe here. Not in this classroom, not under this teacher. The emotional weight of Snape's behavior is often overlooked in favor of praising his bravery. But we must not forget that Harry was a child who had lost both parents, a child who carried the burden of a prophecy, a child whose every move was dissected by the wizarding world. Was it too much to ask that the man who vowed to protect him do so without hatred lacing his every word? Was it too much to expect that he show a shred of the compassion he had once reserved for Lily?
Even when Harry witnessed Snape being attacked by Sirius and Remus in the Shrieking Shack in Prisoner of Azkaban, his response was not gloating. He expressed discomfort, even sympathy. He said, "He was just trying to save my life." That moment of empathy, coming from a boy who had every reason to hate the man, demonstrates a level of moral clarity that Snape never returned. When roles were reversed, Snape never once expressed concern for Harry's well-being beyond the minimum required by his vow.
In Goblet of Fire, Snape immediately accuses Harry of theft when he suspects someone has been stealing ingredients from his private stores. Without evidence, without questioning anyone else, he confronts Harry with the line, "You were out of bed on the night my office was broken into." His voice drips with suspicion, not curiosity. He doesn't seek the truth, he assumes guilt. This wasn't a professor, this was a persecutor. Snape's loathing extended beyond the classroom and into every corner of Harry's life. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry begins to suffer from visions and nightmares due to his connection with Voldemort, Dumbledore appoints Snape to teach him occlumency. It could have been a turning point, a bridge, an opportunity for Snape to finally ease Harry's pain. But what does he do? He humiliates him. "You are lazy and weak, Potter," Snape sneers after Harry struggles to block his thoughts. He invades Harry's mind mercilessly, showing no regard for the trauma within. He does not teach, he assaults. When Harry unintentionally sees one of Snape's memories being bullied by James, he apologizes. He understands the pain, but instead of seeing the opportunity to connect, Snape responds by shutting down the lessons altogether. He slams a door that was barely open, because in truth Snape never wanted to help Harry. He wanted to hurt James's memory. And Harry carried that memory in his face. We must remember that protection without kindness is not compassion, it is obligation. Snape's promise to Dumbledore was a chain around his neck, not a calling from the heart. If he truly saw Lily's eyes in Harry's face, how could he bear to torment those eyes every day? Couldn't he, at the very least, have offered a moment of calm, a safe space, a neutral tone, even a flicker of kindness in a world that had taken everything from the boy? There are teachers in Harry's life who treated him with genuine care, Lupin, who offered quiet understanding, McGonagall, who upheld discipline with fairness, Hagrid, who shared warmth and loyalty. But Snape? Snape chose bitterness over grace. He chose humiliation over healing. He chose to be a warden, not a mentor. And while his courage in the war cannot be denied, it does not erase the pain he caused within the walls of Hogwarts. Harry's school life was hard enough without a constant enemy behind the teacher's desk. He had Voldemort in his dreams, the Dursleys in his summers, and a prophecy hanging over his head. Snape could have lightened that burden, even once, even in passing. A nod of acknowledgement, a fair grade, a shared moment of silence. But none came, only coldness, only contempt. In Half-Blood Prince, Harry begins to suspect that Draco is working for Voldemort. He confides his fears to Dumbledore and later to others, but when Snape finds out, His response is not one of concern for Harry's safety, it is irritation. He confronts Harry in the hallway with menace, not mentorship. "You dare use my own spells against me?" he cries during their final duel. In that moment, all of Snape's secrets come to light, not to build trust, but to wound. Yes, Snape loved Lily. Yes, he died protecting her son. But love, when twisted by guilt and shame, becomes a weapon. Snape's love for Lily did not extend to mercy for Harry. He saved him, but he did not spare him, not once, not ever. When Harry named his son Albus Severus, many fans applauded the tribute. But one must wonder, did Harry truly forgive, or did he simply want to close the chapter? In naming his child after the man who made his adolescence a battleground, did Harry honor Snape's bravery, or bury his own pain? It is tempting to romanticize Snape, to make him a martyr, a tragic figure, but in doing so we risk erasing the cruelty that defined his interactions with a boy who needed a guardian, not a ghost. Snape may have been a hero in the shadows, but to Harry, in the daylight of school corridors and potion dungeons, he was a tormentor. He could have been different. He could have chosen neutrality, silence, apathy, and even that would have been an improvement over the venom he spewed daily. But Snape did not choose indifference. He chose hostility. And so while we may place lilies on his grave and whisper of redemption, we must also speak the truth. Severus Snape did not make Harry's life easier. He made it harder. And that choice, repeated year after year, was not made in darkness. It was made in full view of a child whose only crime was bearing the name Potter. Number 25, killed Dumbledore without hesitation. Of all the moments that haunt the final chapters of Albus Dumbledore's life, few are as chilling as the scene on the astronomy tower. There, in the cold wind sweeping the battlements of Hogwarts, Severus Snape raised his wand and killed the greatest wizard of the age without a flicker of doubt or regret. And while many argue it was Dumbledore's own command, his final request to spare Draco Malfoy's soul and preserve the deeper plan, they often fail to fully grasp what this moment revealed about Snape's soul. His calm execution of the killing curse was not simply an act of reluctant obedience, it was something colder, something darker. As Dumbledore stood, weakened and vulnerable from the cursed ring and the potion he drank in the cave, his last glimmer of strength was not enough to shield him from the wand aimed at his chest. And when the moment came, Severus did not tremble, he did not hesitate, he did not flinch. "Avada Kedavra," he cried, and a burst of green light flared in the night. Dumbledore was blasted backward, his body arcing over the parapet, tumbling like a fallen star into the void below. It is easy to rationalize the moment, to repeat like a mantra that Snape did it because Dumbledore told him to, that it was part of a secret, noble pact to protect Draco, to keep Voldemort's trust, and to ensure the eventual destruction of the Dark Lord. But nothing in Snape's expression, nothing in his voice, suggested he was performing a mercy. There was no whisper of remorse, no break in his resolve, just cold efficiency. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the narration provides no internal monologue from Snape's perspective. We are left with the external world, the sounds, the light, the horrified screams of witnesses. But there is one chilling detail that speaks volumes. Snape gazed for a moment at Dumbledore, and there was revulsion and hatred etched in the harsh lines of his face. That line, brief as it is, makes one wonder, was it merely for the Death Eaters watching nearby? Or did it hint at something buried deeper within him? And then there is the way he fled. Snape did not collapse in grief. He did not linger to grieve beside the man who had trusted him above all others. Instead, he vanished into the night, dragging Draco Malfoy with him, defending himself from Harry's spells with practiced ease. "Don't call me coward!" he shouted when Harry accused him. But the truth is, he wasn't a coward. He was something else. Something colder than fear. He was the man who could kill a mentor without shedding a tear. To kill in war is one thing. To kill in defense, in survival, is another. But to kill a helpless, weakened friend who trusted you, that is a different kind of cruelty. And while Snape had Dumbledore's permission, the way he carried it out stripped away any illusion of warmth or reluctance. The act was clinical, detached. It's hard to believe a man with a heart still intact could perform such an execution without a single tremor. The curse he used, Avada Kedavra, is not a simple spell. It requires intent. It demands a deep, committed desire to kill. Half-heartedness won't do. As Barty Crouch Jr., posing as Mad-Eye Moody, once said in Goblet of Fire, "You need to mean it." And Snape meant it. Whatever inner storms he might have battled before or after, in that moment there was no hesitation. He wanted it done. Some might argue that this very ability to kill so decisively was part of what made him a successful double agent, that a spy must be steel, not flesh. But it's a terrifying thought, to know that a man could be so utterly composed while ending the life of someone who once called him a friend. Snape was many things. Brave, complex, tormented, but kind, gentle, compassionate. That night told a different story. Even Voldemort, in his twisted way, had emotional reactions. He could rage, he could laugh, he could hiss with fury. But Snape, that night, was an iceberg. His calmness wasn't discipline, it was detachment. And that detachment is what makes many doubt the idea that he was ever truly good. How could a good man look into Dumbledore's eyes, those eyes that had protected and defended him for years, and kill him without a flicker of pain? And let's not forget the fear in Dumbledore's voice. When he saw Snape rise up the tower stairs, wand in hand, Dumbledore whispered, "Severus, please." Some believe he was asking Snape to fulfill their plan, but the ambiguity of that moment is staggering. Was he pleading for death, or was he pleading for mercy? Was there a second, terrible realization in his eyes that Snape might not need to be asked twice? The image of Snape standing over a disarmed, dying man and casting the killing curse is seared into the collective memory of the series. It's not a moment of glory, it's not a heroic sacrifice, it's a moment of cold-blooded execution delivered without emotion by a man who showed no cracks in his armor.
And what about afterward? There is no record of Snape mourning, no scene where he falls apart in private, overcome by what he has done. He returns to Voldemort, assumes his place by the Dark Lord's side, and continues the charade. Perhaps that too was part of the plan, but even great actors bleed behind the curtain. Snape did not.
When Harry confronts Snape later in the Deathly Hallows, accusing him of betrayal, of murder, Snape does not apologize, he does not explain, he continues to play the part. And it is not until his dying moment when he gives Harry his memories that we see any hint of humanity, but that's not enough to erase the image of the tower. Many have romanticized Snape's final years. They cling to his love for Lily as proof of his goodness, but love for one person does not excuse cruelty toward others, and love for the dead is not the same as compassion for the living. Dumbledore was alive, and Snape killed him with all the mercy of a guillotine. Even Dumbledore himself, in one of the memories, expressed concern about Snape's soul. "You alone know whether it will harm your soul to help an old man avoid pain and humiliation," he said. He was giving Snape a choice. Not an order. A choice. And Snape chose death for Dumbledore. He chose silence. He chose stillness. He chose the path that would not disturb his conscience, because perhaps it was already numb. Let us imagine for a moment another character in Snape's place. Could Minerva McGonagall have done it? Could Remus Lupin? Could Sirius Black? They might have loved Dumbledore, they might have trusted him, but could they have summoned the will to kill him just because he asked? It's hard to believe. Most hearts would break under the weight of such a request. Snape's did not. And this is why, despite all the noble stories told after his death, some part of the wizarding world still whispers his name with fear, not reverence. He was not just a hero, he was an executioner, a man who could take life without blinking, and in a world where so many fought to preserve life, to protect it, Snape stood apart. His final stand may have been brave, his sacrifices may have been immense, but the coldness with which he killed Dumbledore remains a stain on his legacy. Some will say it was necessary, others will call it noble, but no one can call it kind, because in that tower under the stars, Severus Snape revealed who he truly was, not just a man of secrets, but a man of steel. And steel, while sharp and strong, is not warm. It does not weep, it does not love, it cuts, cleanly, silently, fatally. Number 26 was willing to sacrifice innocence. Of all the dark paths Severus Snape had walked, few were as damning as his willingness to sacrifice innocent lives for the will of a tyrant. Before he became the double agent known to the Order of the Phoenix, before he offered Dumbledore his allegiance, Snape had already sworn fealty to Lord Voldemort. And in doing so, he had accepted a reality where death, torture, and oppression of innocent people, both magical and Muggle, were not only inevitable, but necessary. Snape was not an ignorant youth when he joined the Death Eaters. He was a brilliant man with a deep understanding of magic, its consequences, and the world around him. He knew what Voldemort stood for. He knew what the Dark Mark meant. Yet he took it willingly, carved it into his skin, not out of desperation or fear, but from a cold, calculating belief that power was worth the cost. This wasn't the act of a boy swept up in rebellion. It was the decision of a man who believed the sacrifice of others was acceptable for the cause he chose. One cannot forget that Snape was among the first of his generation to join Voldemort. He aligned himself with the Death Eaters during a time when the wizarding world trembled. People vanished from their homes, families were murdered, Muggle-borns were tortured, and Snape was not merely a bystander to these atrocities, he was a participant, even if not directly wielding the wand each time. His loyalty alone made him complicit. The moment he donned the robes of a Death Eater, he gave his silent blessing to everything Voldemort did. What is perhaps most chilling is that Snape never turned away from Voldemort out of disgust for these acts. He did not defect because he saw the horror of the cause he had chosen. He turned only when the woman he loved, Lily Evans, was threatened. Until that moment, he was willing to allow innocent lives to fall by the wayside. It was never about morality, it was always about personal loss.
His own words are damning. When he begged Dumbledore to protect Lily, he said, "Hide them all then. Keep them safe, please." But when Dumbledore asked, "What will you give me in return, Severus?" Snape answered without hesitation, "Anything." The tragedy lies not in the offer, but in what preceded it. Snape had gone to Voldemort himself and revealed the prophecy about the child who would defeat him. In doing so, he knowingly put two families, the Potters and the Longbottoms, at risk of annihilation.
The prophecy, spoken by Sybil Trelawney and overheard by Snape, was the key that set Voldemort's wrath in motion. It spoke of a child born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. Snape passed this information on without any regard for who might suffer because of it. And while Voldemort ultimately chose the Potters, the Longbottoms were no less endangered. Snape did not protest. He did not warn either family. His silence was permission. His betrayal was deadly. The Potters, though in hiding, were eventually found. James Potter died at the front door. Lily was given the chance to step aside, but chose to die for her child. Harry survived, and it was only then, only after the death of Lily, that Snape began to shift. He pleaded with Dumbledore, not because he wanted to atone for what he'd done, but because he couldn't live with the grief. "You disgust me," Dumbledore told him in that same conversation. And rightly so. Snape's remorse, no matter how deep, could not bring James and Lily back. It could not unmake the trauma Harry carried with him for years. It could not heal the minds of Frank and Alice Longbottom, tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange, another Death Eater whose actions were enabled by the ideology Snape supported. In his early years of service, Snape was surrounded by people who committed crimes that shattered lives, and he said nothing. Some argue that Snape was a spy and therefore his sins were balanced by his later sacrifices, but redemption does not erase culpability, it merely complicates it. A man who starts a fire and later helps to extinguish it is still the one who struck the match. Dumbledore himself knew this. He never tried to whitewash Snape's past. He used it as a weapon, as leverage. He saw the darkness in Snape and kept it close, not out of trust, but necessity. Even during his time at Hogwarts before the war reached its peak, Snape was not a protector of innocence. He bullied students. He abused his position. He targeted Neville Longbottom with cruelty that could only be described as sadistic, knowing full well the suffering Neville's family had endured at the hands of Death Eaters. He took pleasure in humiliating children, perhaps to remind himself of a time when he had power, real or imagined, over others. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape tries to justify his choices. "You have no idea what I have done. You don't know what I have sacrificed," he tells Harry. But that sacrifice was not for the world. It was not even for justice. It was for Lily. Always for Lily. As if one woman's death outweighed all the others he had ignored. As if love for her somehow excused his indifference to the pain he helped cause. The truth is that Snape's allegiance to Voldemort was not a phase. It was a deliberate commitment, one that lasted for years. He might not have been as openly sadistic as Bellatrix or as fanatically devoted as Barty Crouch Jr., but he was just as guilty of enabling Voldemort's rise. He knew what the Dark Lord wanted: purity of blood, domination, subjugation, and he went along with it until the cost reached his own doorstep. When the Muggleborns were hunted, did Snape speak? When people like Ted Tonks were murdered for their blood, did he act? No. He remained silent, always silent. He helped Voldemort rise again, even if passively, by withholding opposition until it was too late. He made his bed, and only when the blood of the woman he loved soaked the sheets did he begin to recoil. Some might say that Snape was trapped, that once he joined Voldemort, escape was impossible, but others did escape. Regulus Black turned against Voldemort and paid with his life. Sirius Black refused to join even though it meant estrangement from his family. These men made choices. So did Snape. And his choices led to graves. The tragedy of Severus Snape is not that he was misunderstood, it's that he was too often excused. The fandom has turned his pain into virtue, his guilt into romance. But guilt is not goodness. Regret is not heroism. Snape was brave, yes, he faced death many times, but bravery in the service of penance is not the same as moral courage. He never stood up when it counted most. He only acted when it was too late. Snape's story is soaked in blood, the blood of innocence, the blood of friends, and for many years he was willing to let it flow, willing to turn a blind eye, willing to nod in agreement as people were tortured and killed for nothing more than their bloodline. This willingness cannot be erased by a final act of sacrifice. It must be remembered as a warning. In Deathly Hallows, Snape finally dies, offering Harry a glimpse into his memories. It is a haunting scene, but not a redemptive one. His last act is not a confession of guilt, but a desperate attempt to ensure that Lily's child will survive. "Look at me," he whispers, longing to see her eyes one last time. Not the eyes of justice, not the eyes of innocence. Her eyes. Always her. There's no question that Snape was a complex character, but complexity is not absolution. His decision to join Voldemort, his willingness to sacrifice others, his silence in the face of evil, these are not things that can be forgiven simply because he later chose to fight on the side of good. His past was a path paved with pain, and he walked it willingly. Even the headmaster who trusted him most knew the risk. "Severus," Dumbledore once said, "you must be the one to kill me. It is the only way." Trust for Dumbledore was a tool, not a reward. He knew that in the end, Snape's loyalty came not from righteousness, but from personal grief. He knew that the man who once gave Voldemort a prophecy that would kill a child could just as easily kill again if asked the right way. Snape's story is not one of redemption, but of consequence. Of what happens when a man gives himself to evil for reasons he thinks are justified, and then realizes far too late that the price is always paid by others. Number 27 was cruel even to fellow professors. It was the first year Harry Potter set foot in the ancient corridors of Hogwarts, a castle brimming with mysteries, enchantments, and shadows older than time itself. As students settled into their new lives, marveling at moving staircases and bewitched ceilings, something darker simmered beneath the surface. And at the heart of this tension stood a man cloaked in black, with eyes as cold as obsidian and a voice as sharp as a whip. Professor Severus Snape. From the very first moment Snape appeared in the Great Hall, his demeanor demanded obedience and inspired fear. But his hostility wasn't reserved only for students. Even among his colleagues, Snape demonstrated a pattern of callousness that bordered on cruelty. One of the most telling and overlooked examples of this is the way he treated Professor Quirinus Quirrell. Quirrell, with his stammering voice, trembling hands and nervous glances, was a far cry from the imposing presence of Snape. Though he had returned from a supposed year of study in Albania, he now seemed perpetually anxious, perspiring even in the mild warmth of the castle. He was a man clearly struggling with something. And though hindsight reveals his dark alliance with Lord Voldemort, at the time no one at Hogwarts suspected the shy Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher to be anything more than a cowardly scholar. Yet Snape targeted him with unrelenting cruelty. Their interactions were not limited to private disagreements or silent contempt. No, Snape ensured his disdain for Quirrell was publicly known. He mocked him, dismissed his lessons as useless, and openly belittled him in front of students. In Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Rowling writes, Snape was looking as though the first person to ask him for a love potion would be force-fed poison. It was this same demeanor he reserved for Quirrell, sarcasm laced with venom, disdain cloaked in formal politeness, and pressure applied like a slow-acting curse. In one particular scene during the Quidditch match, When Harry's broom began to buck and twist mid-air, Snape was seen muttering a counter-curse while keeping a fixed gaze on the boy. Yet in the same moment, Hermione suspected Snape of being behind the sabotage. It was later revealed that it was Quirrell who had tried to jinx Harry's broom. But the irony was profound. Snape, who was actually trying to protect the boy, had acted with such cold suspicion in the weeks leading up to the incident that even the protagonists mistook him for the villain. And where did that suspicion come from? Primarily from Snape's own behavior. In the Forbidden Forest, when Harry overhears a conversation between Snape and Quirrell, the tone is unmistakably threatening. "You don't want me as your enemy, Quirrell," Snape warns. His voice, described as silkily dangerous, was not the voice of a concerned colleague. It was the voice of a predator toying with prey. The professor didn't merely suspect Quirrell, he confronted him in private, not to seek the truth diplomatically, but to intimidate him into submission. There's something inherently disturbing about the way Snape handled the matter. At this point in the story, Snape didn't have proof of Quirrell's allegiance to Voldemort. Even Dumbledore didn't know the full truth yet. Snape, driven by instinct or old suspicions, chose aggression over investigation. He didn't approach Quirrell with caution or professionalism. Instead, he isolated him, threatened him, and created an atmosphere of fear that mirrored the very tactics used by Death Eaters. We must ask, what if Quirrell had truly been innocent? What if his nervousness was nothing more than social anxiety? In that case, Snape's behavior would be nothing short of workplace harassment. His lack of empathy, his immediate assumption of guilt, and his refusal to treat Quirrell as an equal reveal a deeper flaw in Snape's character. His cruelty wasn't reserved for enemies. It extended to anyone weaker, more vulnerable, or simply unworthy in his eyes. Snape's eyes were boring into Quirrell's, Harry remembers, during one of their secretive exchanges. It was clear that whatever Snape was doing, Quirrell was not enjoying it. There is a sinister power dynamic at play here. Snape, a powerful legilimens, likely invaded Quirrell's thoughts, without consent, without warrant, not once, but repeatedly. It was a violation not only of privacy but of dignity, and yet Quirrell never fought back. This wasn't only because of Voldemort's presence on the back of his head, controlling much of his will. It was also because Snape had built a reputation that paralyzed dissent. Even among professors, few dared to challenge him. He operated on the fringe of morality, always protected by Dumbledore's elusive trust and his own air of menace. His authority, like a storm cloud, hung over everyone at Hogwarts, casting long shadows over what should have been bonds of camaraderie. There is a temptation to excuse Snape's cruelty by invoking his tragic backstory. Indeed, he suffered humiliation and abuse in his youth, and his love for Lily Evans adds layers of complexity to his soul. But trauma does not justify tyranny. His inability or refusal to show kindness to those around him cannot be seen as an extension of inner pain. In truth, it became a weapon. He used it to dominate, to punish, to exert control in a world that had once rendered him powerless. Professor McGonagall, stern yet just, offers a stark contrast. Though firm with her students and colleagues, she never humiliated anyone without cause. She believed in order, but also in respect. Snape believed in control, and Quirrell, harmless on the surface, timid to a fault, became the perfect target. Whether or not Snape knew the full extent of Quirrell's guilt, his method of dealing with it was based on fear, not justice. There's also the matter of appearances. In front of students, Snape belittled Quirrell's teaching, mocked his stutter, and undermined his authority. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated move to strip Quirrell of credibility, and the students followed suit. In the Gryffindor common room, Hermione once said, "Quirrell's a bit of a joke, isn't he?" A joke not because of his content, but because his fellow teacher had reduced him to one. Power in Hogwarts was not only wielded through magic, it was expressed in status, tone, and fear. Snape mastered all three. His voice, low and slow, made every word a blade. His gaze could freeze the air in a room. And in his pursuit of justice against Quirrell, he displayed not only vigilance, but the relish of superiority. There is a difference between being watchful and being vindictive. Snape crossed that line effortlessly. Some may argue that Snape's harshness was ultimately protective, that his surveillance of Quirrell prevented disaster, but one must ask, could the same goal not have been achieved through dialogue, through teamwork, through mutual observation? Dumbledore himself operated by gathering information patiently. Snape, instead, stormed into the role of enforcer and made sure Quirrell knew who the dominant predator was. Snape's relationship with Quirrell wasn't unique. It reflected a broader pattern. He bullied Neville Longbottom, a student so fearful that a boggart turned into Snape himself. He insulted Hermione Granger, calling her an insufferable know-it-all in front of her classmates. And he singled out Harry from day one simply because of the shape of his face and the memory of James Potter. These weren't tactical maneuvers, they were acts of cruelty dressed in robes of authority. In the end, Quirrell died, burned by the very love that protected Harry. And Snape? He remained in Hogwarts, his methods unquestioned, his coldness unexplored. But the damage he did was real, not just to students, but to fellow educators who may have needed help more than threats. We often romanticize Snape's complexity. He was a spy, a double agent, a man torn by guilt and love. But heroism is not an excuse for cruelty. True courage lies in restraint, in compassion, in the ability to see even the weakest as worthy of respect. Severus Snape, for all his brilliance, failed in that. His treatment of Quirinus Quirrell remains one of the earliest, clearest examples of a man who, though trusted by Dumbledore, wielded his power like a sword and showed no mercy to those who could not fight back. And that, more than any secret mission, reveals the true nature of the man behind the curtain of shadows.